Thank you for joining. I am joining you from Windsor, Ontario, Canada, just south of Detroit. We are actually the only area located south of America, so Canadian. So thank you all for joining today. I started this research back in 2017 during my master's studies at Lawrence Tech. I was doing my master's in architecture. I did a thesis route and did research on public toilets in the 19th century, particularly looking at London, Paris, and New York. Since then, I've worked at a few design firms and have had the opportunity to design a few washrooms that I'll be presenting on today. I also am a researcher for the Ontario Building Association of Architects. I'm writing a few articles on the first 3D printed house in Ontario that's being built, as well as the involvement of Habitat for Humanity, as well as the logistics that goes behind the building and permitting dynamics of the 3D printed house. I'm also treasurer of the Windsor Regional Society of Architects. We do a lot of community work, and my most recent role right now is with Community Housing Corporation. I'm a ergonomics / sustainability, or sorry, not sustainability, accessibility manager. Basically, I have not yet started the role. That'll be as of next week. But for the past year, I have been working at the City of Windsor in policy planning, looking at the policy aspect of permitting and what it requires to get from one end to the other. So my range of experience is quite kind of all over the place, but hopefully what I present today is a little bit of everything that I've compiled together that hopefully will give you a bit of an insight on public toilets. Is that a good intro, Kim? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So can you all see my screen? Perfect, public toilets. Okay. So as mentioned, welcome to a sneak peek into the life cycle of the public toilet through historic interpretive research, professional design practice, and a post-occupancy study. I will be presenting my findings today, as well as some background. So like I mentioned, this started in 2017 through 19, was a historic interpretive research at LTU. Basically, I compiled for the first semester, I did a general research, and I tried to identify some pressure points throughout history that marked significance in the life cycle of the public toilet. And that kind of landed me to three cities, London, Paris, and New York during the 19th century. There had been significant events that made me realize that these were important nodes, important points in history to make note of, that kind of informed the rest of the research. So basically, I broke down my research into three categories: policy, hygiene, and design. And I defined those three areas: policy being the infrastructure changes, policies that influence change that eventually affected the public toilet; design, as in anything relating to the built environment; and hygiene, that related more so with the ideology and the thinking of the time, and how hygiene was perceived at the time. So through this triangulated approach, I broke down my information, and it helped me collect information doing so because the research in architecture alone in public toilets was very limited. So this kind of helped me expand my research and being able to collect more data on these periods. So I looked at 19th century up until 2020. And basically I categorized them in three main points that I'll be talking about today: the night soil period, the cholera period, and the modern period. So if we begin in the night soil period, we look at trends that were similar to all three cities in London, Paris, and New York. Population was increasing at like a rapid rate that was unprecedented. And this came due to the changes after World War II and the Industrial Revolution. Cities were growing and streets were becoming more and more populated, more and more filthy. There weren't any infrastructure yet, so a lot of the soil that was collected or the waste would just be dumped on the outskirts of town or in the surrounding waterways. One of the tools used to defecate in a home was the chamber pot. It was a porcelain device used to defecate in, and once defecated in, the remains would be just tossed out the window. And that's where the term comes from, garde loup, to like watch your shoe or watch your step. It was meant as like a term of courtesy once, tossing your excrement out the window. And so this was a regular trend. There had been a flush toilet that was designed at the time, dating back to 1596 by Sir John Harrington. He published a book called The Metamorphoses of the Ajax. It was the closest thing to what the modern toilet would have been. However, it wasn't connected to any infrastructure, and it was mainly designed to eliminate the smell. We see similar trends in New York and London, as mentioned. A lot of the excrements that were collected from the streets and that were tossed out from windows were just usually tossed in on the outskirts of town or in rivers, contaminating fresh water, etc. In 1842, we start seeing legislations that kind of start playing key roles in how we perceive hygiene. There was a report that was published by Sir Edward Chadwick to clean the air and to purify streets. Streets had become very dingy, contaminated with sewers. This sparked an interest in a lot of the expansion. At the same time, the landscape was changing, so we see an expansion in sewer systems at the same time as these public notices that are being issued to address the issues of hygiene at the time. So we see these trends both in all three cities, in London, in Paris, and in New York. In Paris, similarly, we see unprecedented growth of population, similar trends in terms of what's happening with contamination of water. There was a shortage of usage of fresh water, yet it was still contaminated. Waste was still thrown in it. There wasn't anything really in place that set the standards for what was considered hygienic. Streets in Paris in particular too were very narrow. All three cities were infamously known for being dirty. In Paris, for defecation, there were barrels of easements placed throughout the cityscape, and people would usually use them to defecate. And for women in particular, this is one of my favorites, they would form, it was a kind of I would consider it a social kind of event where one woman would want to use the washroom in public. And so a group of women would form a circle around one person in the middle, and they would pretend to pick a flower. So picking a flower is a term that they used to use as using the washroom. And that was probably the beginning of women in society kind of had a smaller role, and we'll see as I'll present, you'll see that the public toilet was at the very end of the century was catered to women, but in the beginning, because their minimal role, the washroom wasn't really catered to them. So that's one social norm. Paris did have bans on urination that dated back to the 1700s. However, it didn't stop people from urinating in public. We also see similar trends in New York in terms of growth, population growth, and in New York in particular, They used outhouses, and they were temporary structures that would be relocated or emptied by night soil men. Either way, they weren't connected to the infrastructure, and particularly in New York, sewer systems were the last to make it indoor because of the perception of sewers relating to sewers had an sewers were perceived as having dangerous side effects that were not acceptable in indoor settings for a very long time in New York, up until I believe the late 1870s. So here, just wanted to point out same trends as Paris and London, with night soil men just gathering soil or content and just tossing it in and around the cities, contaminating, creating such so even in narrower streets, pools of cess would collect, and that would also cause more deterioration in the city. So there were a lot of side effects to having waste just kind of disposed everywhere. It wasn't until 1819, in some area in the 1800s, you start seeing some prohibitions, as mentioned, that would permit cleaning of the cities. And in 1910, indoor plumbing was finally permitted in New York. This takes us to the cholera period because it kind of overlaps with the night soil period in terms of legislations that were coming out supporting public hygiene. The cholera outbreak in 1832 in New York claimed thousands of lives. It affected the waterways. There was, and this is kind of where the idea of sewers is kind of muddied with fact and what was real and what wasn't. There was a period, obviously, when cholera was spread throughout the water, and I'll come back to that in England. But in the States at the time, in New York, there was actual articles that were published explaining the dangers of sewers being indoor. So it was a huge taboo. The Metropolitan Health Act of 1866 tried to address issues of hygiene and sanitation. So these legislations were coming out around the time that cholera was predominant in the area. And we see improvements coming from those acts throughout the centuries through infrastructure changes and companies that were commissioned to clean the cities, like New York, probably the last one in 1872, that kind of marked the end of the night soil period for New York. So when cholera came along, so did a lot of legislations that changed the way cities functioned in terms of hygiene. So as mentioned, the cholera era sparked a lot of interest in public health, and some of these legislations are highlighted here. We see similar trends in Paris, where cholera outbreak had been also a pandemic in Paris, and this kind of also sparked interest in sanitation. Legislations were being passed to expand the sewer systems. Paris was at an advantage compared to the two other cities because dating back in 1834, the pissoir was designed by Claude de Rumboteau, who introduced the urinal in 1834, also known as the Vespasien. And basically, the design of these Vespasiens kind of set the tone, or set the infrastructure for later toilets that came into place. And the way the infrastructure was designed in Paris made it a lot easier for the city to transition to modern day public toilets because they existed at a very early on, and they were embedded in the city fabric very early on compared to London and New York. So here we see the city map of so Louis Napoleon, he had this idea of what he wanted Paris to look like, but he was also being influenced at the same time by cities like London, and London was also being influenced by New York and Paris. So the trends that we see in one city are kind of seen in all three cities. In France, this brought on the revolution. In London, with the cholera outbreak, Dr. John Snow realized the relationship between the cholera pandemic and made the realization that there was a focal point in his area near where he resided, where cholera was being, where the water was being contaminated by cholera. And he used a map to map out where the outbreak was coming from, and that's what made him realize that it was coming from a single source. This is very important because it is the first time that scientists are visually mapping out, visualizing like a map of contamination that's coming from a single source. Unfortunately, his ideas were dismissed. However, he took the liberty of going to that fountain of water and breaking it so that people would not use it and not get contaminated with it. So this was happening around the 1800s. At the same time in New York, we were seeing the articles being published about sewers and their dangers. So there's some, in my opinion, there's some like plausible ideas for why sewers were believed to be dangerous at the time, but the information was all muddied. So looking at significant moments in history too, in 1858, some infrastructure changes were happening. Bezalgette formed his plan around the sewer system. So many city plans were being planned around the infrastructure. That was a great part in developing plans for the city. In 1885, the Thames River was coined the Great Stink. We also see legislation after legislation being passed to address hygiene and sanitation. In 1872, this is a significant point in the life cycle of the public toilet because this legislation basically forced all toilets to be water-based rather than cesspools. So all new infrastructure that was all the public toilets that were being created at the time, and we'll touch on that, right at this point had to be transitioned from cess to water-based. And the person that was commissioned behind these changes was crapper flushing system. This started in London, and basically this design kind of spread all over Europe and parts of North America, but it was probably the first of its kind to be designed. So this transitions us into the modern period. It also overlaps around the same time as the cholera pandemic was happening. And again, we see legislations happening in New York. In New York, it was a little different in the way that public toilets were incorporated, because public toilets were first introduced as these like freestanding modern objects, part of street furniture. And later on, throughout the century, they became embedded in interior spaces. In New York in particular, it was easier to implement them as part of the subway station transportation system. So when public toilets were first introduced, one of the most predominant ones were in the subway systems. And around this time, we see New York expanding in terms of sewer systems, as well as as well as London, Paris, and New York. And in Paris in particular, as mentioned earlier, the transition was simpler because the infrastructure was already there, and they had a lot of, they had over 12,000 pissoirs in the city. So, so making the transition throughout the centuries was a lot simpler. In London, during the 1850s, I think this is probably the biggest break for the public toilet in terms of popularity. The Great Exhibition was hosted in England, and there was a plumber by the name of George Jennings who introduced the monkey closet. It was the pay a penny concept, where you would insert a penny to use the washroom. You would get your shoe polished. You would get your hair combed. It was kind of like a spa-like feel, where you went in, you rejuvenated, and the flush toilet was the first of its kind. So everyone paid, I think over 80,000 people at the time paid to flush the toilet. Paid to use it. So it became such a great hit. They were scheduled to close after the exhibition. However, it was such a success that they decided to keep them running, and they were generating a profit. But mind you, around this time, they were only for gentlemen, as mentioned earlier, and they also they always had like a maintenance staff on site that took care of the washroom. So it wasn't just like standalone. There's also maintenance involved in it, which is very crucial, I think, in my opinion, to understand how they were successfully implemented. Because when we think of public toilets today, no one's guarding them, no one's like sitting there and watching like a security kind of, or not just security, but in terms of maintenance in general. That's just something that does not exist today. So as mentioned earlier, as public toilets became more embedded in the city fabric, they transitioned from this like freestanding object to one embedded in like interior spaces. And in England, a very popular one was the underground washrooms. A lot of those spaces today have been converted to restaurants and whatnot, since they are like well done spaces. And this is also around the time where, as mentioned earlier, there was a change in the sewer system. So when the change in the sewer system happened, changes to the Jennings toilet also happened, but at the same time, it was gaining momentum. It was being added in multiple cities around Europe. And there were basically two types. There was a gentleman's type of washroom where you went in and kind of got the full spa experience, and one that was for like the lesser class, where you just went in to use the toilet. So there were classes of different types of washrooms. Again, these were only designed for gentlemen at the time, which started sparking an interest during the suffragette movement around the 1800s, is when it was gaining momentum in London. So the public toilet played like a very crucial role, I guess, in advocating for women's rights during the suffragette movement, because it was claiming their space in public. And this was being like identified for the first time, and many other areas started advocating for the right in public as well. But we see this trend continuing out through history. This is kind of, I would say, probably where like we really start seeing groups of people fighting for the rights to access public toilets. And as mentioned, public toilets, once they became embedded in interior spaces, they also required a level of maintenance over time that was not available due to finances. Typically, washrooms in the policy spectrum is the last on the list, and it's easily forgotten, and easily, like in terms of finances, when policies are being implemented or being planned, it's usually not the most financed area. And so over time that gap kind of grew, and it just it really deteriorated the conditions of the washrooms. They were no longer an object of technology, of interest. They just became part of the social fabric that were necessary and at one point unavailable, and they're just starting to make a comeback, I would say, in the last century. But there was a gap between the 19th century and the 21st century. Probably like the 20th century had probably like, it was probably one of the worst times for the washroom, especially considering the late 20th century. So throughout this research, it made me realize that some places in London came to the conclusion that some places in London had been implementing hybridized networks of washrooms. So rather than it being something that provided through a top-down approach by the government, it could be something that's embedded in an existing private establishment, yet is still public, yet because the government subsidizes parts of the building. So for example, you can walk into a restaurant that's completely private, but the washroom portion of it would be subsidized by the government, hence it's public. You don't necessarily need to use the restaurant to use the washroom. So in London, they've optimized the amounts of public toilets provided because of their hybridized provision of public and private. And this is something that's starting to pick up in other cities, but London really took the initiative in the early 2000s or 2010s, I would say. And this I concluded with the idea at the time of my research that, you know, these hybridized networks are kind of where it's at right now. And it would be interesting to see what kind of dynamic that creates between public and private. So in the last 2 centuries, the public toilet has fundamentally has a fundamental role in modernizing the way cities function. As mentioned, it once stood as an object of modernity, as a street furniture, and it evolved into being into embedded spaces, shifting like exterior urban conditions into interiorized urban issues. And this leads me to my professional design practice in the last, between 2019 and 2020. I had the opportunity to design 3 unique washrooms, and I'll talk about each one in particular. So the first one, and in all 3 cases, the washrooms play a dual role. So the first case is the Gallery Riverfront in Windsor, Ontario. And sorry, I just realized it's not fully. Okay, so the first project presented today is a gallery on the riverfront of Windsor, Ontario. You might notice Detroit in the background. So this design was, this whole project was sparked by the replacement of 2 existing washrooms that are located in its current location. So the client was the city of Windsor, and they were looking to renovate the washrooms, but also create a gallery space in that area as an opportunity to develop the site while, you know, providing public amenities. So what we designed was the following, and this is a gallery space for a train station, or a train that's going to be part of the display in the gallery area. The washrooms are designed so that they could function year-round, while the gallery functions on a seasonal basis. And the way this is achieved is by providing access through the interior and exterior as well. But we also provided 2 other washrooms, 2 universal washrooms, and I'll explain that in a second. And those would also, basically we designed it so that in case of all scenarios, you would always have access to the washrooms, even in case where the public, even when the gallery was closed off for private functions, you would still have access to a universal washroom that was accessible all year round. So through this design, there were some logistics that needed to be worked out, because this gallery is supposed to serve alcohol. So that played a lot of, that had a huge role in how the designs were designed functionally, because the space on the exterior had to be closed off in certain times because of when alcohol was served and when it was not. So there was a lot of logistics that went into the placement of them. So even though they might not look the most optimal in terms of logistics and how the site functions, it worked out in terms of them working year round. So this building right now is going through, so this is a close-up of the washrooms. Basically, these are the two universal washrooms that I discussed earlier. And what universal washrooms are in Ontario, basically every new build has to have a universal washroom. And a universal washroom caters to all types of disabilities, but also it's supposed to be like as the name mentions, universal. So so in terms of accessibility, it's accessible for any types of disability, but also it's gender neutral. So this helped us in designing this toilet, because we were able to eliminate or we were able to get away with having those the two universal washrooms that run year round. But also you'll notice that in all these designs, if all three of them maybe, that there weren't any urinals provided. And the reason is we were trying to maximize the use of the space, and looking at gender norms now as being an issue. And currently we are designing gendered spaces, but we don't know how that's going to be like in the future. So we tried to keep it, we tried to eliminate urinals so that the space could be maximized to its full potential in case it needed to be used in other ways. So that concludes the first project that I worked on. Currently, I had the opportunity to see it on the policy end as well. It's currently in site plan control at the City of Windsor. There's issues in terms of its location, because as of recent, it's on Indigenous land, so it sparked a bigger conversation. And they're looking to relocate it altogether, but at another location on the riverfront that also is replacing public toilets. So the point of it is still there. It's still replacing public toilets, but it might just be shifted in another location. So the other project that I'll be talking about probably a little more extensively, but I'll just touch up on it now, is the John R. Homestead Park. This is a historic site located in Harrow, Ontario. And the site is a location for, it's a tourist location, so people go there to make maple syrup. A lot of schools go there for trips, school trips and whatnot. The site plan that you're looking at, we implemented a similar idea where they needed washrooms was their main priority, is what they came to us for, what the initial grant was for. And so that grant kind of expanded into a whole heritage center. And so the building operates in a similar way as the gallery, where it operates on a seasonal basis, but the washrooms are designed to function year round. And we implemented similar ideas where we did not include urinals to maximize the effectiveness of the space, in case urinals were not needed. Toilets would also always be needed. So just quick overall floor plan. This is a dive-in. Well, actually, before we do that. So again, here we see the two washrooms. Interior, this is the exterior access, and this is the interior access. And just across the hall from it, we have a universal washroom. And I'll get into this a little bit more. But moving on to the next project is the fire station that was built in Essex, Ontario. This was built this year, so it has not been open yet. For this washroom design, we were looking at maximizing the efficiency of the space. And we looked at in the beginning, we had a couple proposals for washrooms. the clients knew that they wanted to consolidate the washrooms or showers in some capacity, but they were unsure how. And so we came up with a design of a toilet space and a shower space that was universal, but had wall stalls to the wall and to the floor rather than the typical gaps. So they were in their individual rooms, as you can see in the floor plan. And then across the hallway from it, there's a universal washroom. And this is key here in this plan because the universal washroom is actually the reason why the clients were sold on the idea of consolidating spaces. Because there was still, the conversations that were gathered with the client were that the use of two gendered spaces seemed very unnecessary because their staff was very minimal given the location of this fire station. But also, even though they anticipated, they had very minimal female staff, probably about, I want to say less than 5%. But even they were in discussion, they were discussing even with that growth, it felt unnecessary with the growth of like female staff, they still felt it was unnecessary to have two separate spaces, especially given the budget and the scope of the project and what they wanted in that space. So it didn't make sense to utilize most of that space for washrooms and showers when they could consolidate the space. But what really sold it was the universal washroom, because we did have a few people in the meetings that were hesitant on being comfortable being in an environment that was co-ed, especially being in a shower washroom setting. So the fact that there was a universal washroom there that also had a shower gave occupants the option of not participating in this type of design layout. So that was a key design fundamental factor of why we went with what we did. And the best part about universal washrooms is that they're part of code. So even if the architect, the contractor, no matter who had their hand in the game, they could not eliminate that washroom because it was part of code. So we had to. So it really helps drive the design because there's something else that's forcing you to do something in place. So that kind of that's kind of how this design ended. And I just want to make note that in all three designs, you'll notice that there's also proximity to the washrooms of the universal washroom to the regular washrooms. There is a provision in the building code that prohibits you from having it more than a certain distance away from the actual washroom, which in my opinion, I think is very crucial, because once you start separating spaces, you're also separating the way the building functions, and there's a lot more to it that becomes an issue. So moving into my post-occupancy study, back to the John R. Homestead Park. This is the only building, or this is the building that's been open the most since all three have been designed. It opened last year during COVID. You may or may not be aware that Canada has had some serious restrictions on everything. So we've been really cooped up for the past 2 years, I want to say. And so this building hasn't really been utilized to its full potential. Sorry. This building has not been utilized to its full potential. So they anticipate, like I mentioned, it's a site where maple syrup is made. It's a 19th century vibe, so just coincidentally has nothing to do with the research portion. But so far it's been open for a year, and I'm working with the facility manager to come up with a post-occupancy study to help figure out a few things that I'll touch upon. So this is the original floor plan or layout for the washrooms. As you can see, there's an interior and exterior access. They are mirrored, and there is a universal washroom within close proximity. So this space in particular in between the two is right now the subject of discussion that myself and the facility manager are probably the most interested in. And I'll explain that in a moment. So this is the washroom looking out from the outside, looking into the building. And just a few snapshots to give you a sense of what the space looks like. So if you're in the women's washroom, this is kind of your view to the men's. And as mentioned earlier, when they were designed, this is the final product, which does not look 100% like the proposed design, and I'll touch up on those. So they are gendered spaces. Both spaces have change tables, but you'll notice that this space in between is quite spacious for a hallway, and that's because, so this is what it looks out into. And the hallways are heavily utilized right now by parents, by people accompanying other people. Usually there's a desk sitting in this corner, and they have this this board that was proposed to create some kind of interesting moment, rather than just it being a waiting space where, you know, you could wait, but you could also be up to date with what's going on, all the events and whatnot. So this is a space looking, this is a view looking in, further in, and as you get further in, you'll notice this is the hallway, and across the street, or across the hallway, is the universal washroom. So they're very close in proximity. This is an office space with a window that is intended to, the door is also designed with glass. So the intent is that whoever is in this office space is able to keep an eye on what's going on in the washrooms for security reasons. So there's that that was designed in the thinking process, because if you look back to the floor plans, so the office would be across from here looking in, and you would see all the way through. So this place would be somewhat monitored and not completely unsecured. So change tables in both washrooms. So far, what was built was not 100% entirely as designed. So for example, the urinals were installed, and that's partially due to some financial reasons. Also, you'll notice that in some areas, or I'll get back to that. This is the universal washroom. Some of the budget cuts that were made were change tables are not required by code in universal washrooms, but the space is required by code. So when the building was built, they did provide the space for the change table, but they did not provide the change table itself. However, the client, after about a year use of the building, realized they did need the change table. So now they've ordered one, and it's coming in. So hopefully in the next presentation, there will be a change table there. And the change tables were probably the most well received in the men's washroom, because it's still a practice that's not heavily done in washroom designs, where like change tables are provided in men's washrooms. So male or people who identify as male or who have issues going into washrooms have really appreciated the change tables. So this is the entrance to the washrooms. The walls are displayed walls, so they're kind of just tucked in. And then there's the universal washroom just across the hallway. And this hallway space is designed to be kind of like an event space. So the events from this area are intended to spill over into this area. As mentioned, this study right now is very preliminary, as they haven't had the opportunity to have school buses or schools attend because of COVID and restrictions. They haven't had the opportunity to do that. However, they are starting to get bookings for schools, private schools right now, because they're a little less restrictive about things than public schools, but the facility manager is anticipating busloads of people at a time. So we're going to be able to collect that data and see how the washrooms actually function when they're at full capacity. So a few things to point out that were not as the design had been intended, where you'll notice there are three there are three sinks, and one of them by code is supposed to be barrier free. However, when this was designed, and this is where like contractors, the contractor in this case did things slightly different, in that they the last space, the third space, was supposed to be a barrier-free one, and in this case, there's supposed to be more legroom at the bottom. But they were able to get away with not doing that by providing instead of providing like an actual space where you'd be able to use it as a person in a wheelchair, they just provided some kind of covering for the material that was underneath that would suffice as barrier free. However, its function is still not barrier free. So right now, the one issue that they're facing is that people on wheelchairs who are using these washrooms can't really wash their hands here, even though technically it is to code. They're not able to use them. So right now they're heavily relying on the one washroom. So I'm curious to see how this is going to evolve, because it's really going to it's going to result in some kind of refurbishing of the washroom to accommodate for the barrier free, or there's going to be a lot more traffic on the universal washroom. And another issue that was pointed out, and these are issues that are just being pointed out, but like I mentioned, it hasn't been utilized at its full capacity, so we don't really know what's going to surface after this year. But as of now, the main issue is the barrier-free access to the sinks. And the other is the materials that were selected. The finishes were not as per design. So some of the finishes were hand dryers rather than towels. Or paper towels, or the type of hand dryers, they just tack them on to drywall. So this was creating some peeling issues on the surfaces. As you know, moisture and drywall doesn't go well together. So as an easy fix, they proposed to just carry the tile over to the wall, and that's kind of what they did for now. So there have been a couple of incidents where they've had to improvise on their design, but as of now, those are the only two primary issues. But mostly, this space was very well perceived. This intermediate space was very well received because of its ability to function as like a waiting area that is still separate from the washrooms, but still kind of has its own sense of space and identity. So for the next year, not only will I be looking at issues surrounding the toilets that are currently designed, like the actual spaces and the fixtures and the placement and all that, but also looking at the flexibility of this space in particular, and what this space could offer, what else it could offer, and how to maximize its usage. And in a way, help us understand, like, what if these buildings become more part of the norm? What if like a freestanding toilet alone is not something that's functional, but what if it became embedded in something bigger that that could be managed year round? Because this building is managed year round. So it makes the toilets ability to function year round possible. And hopefully the lessons learned from this public toilet design will, like from this post-occupancy study, will inform some of the research and questions that are going to be raised in the two other washrooms. So, so there's not much on the post-occupancy study, as it literally just started this year. The building opened early last year. But that's where I currently am at today, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Alla. That was I really loved how you formatted this presentation with such a rich and deep historical review, and then how you carried that through to your professional practice. That is so helpful and useful to all of us. So thank you for doing that. I want to open up
Thank you.
the floor for any students that have questions. I will also keep my eye on the chat if you want to type your question, but otherwise we will open the floor to you. Feel free to unmute and ask away.
Hi, I have a question. I noticed that the mirrors in the bathrooms are slanted, and I was just wondering why that is, if there's like a certain reason for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So this goes back to my point of being partially design barrier free. So part of the design of when you're designing a sink with a mirror for a toilet for a barrier free design, you'll notice it here more so, but it's the same in the other. So if I do this, so the mirrors are slanted on an angle, and that angle is determined by the Ontario Building Code. And basically it's so that if you're sitting in a wheelchair and you are using the sink, you're able to get a full view of yourself rather than it being straight. Because once it's straight, you don't have that full view from your seated chair. So the research comes from building code, really, and it's implemented by code. So it's out of the washrooms that were like in the universal washroom, this is by code. It has to be, it's required to be at a certain angle in order to accommodate a wheelchair. But you'll notice in the women's washroom, it's only the last one. And even actually, I'm glad you pointed it out, because even in this design, the mirror was the only portion that was accessible. Everything else about that one sink was not accessible at all. And like I mentioned, they were able to, because they were doing everything on a very tight budget, and they were trying to cut out as much as possible. Unfortunately, some of the design features for that barrier-free space was cut out, even though it technically meets code. It doesn't necessarily work. But the mirror is for code. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hopefully.
I have a question. I think it was when you talked about the project for the fire building.
Yep.
And you said that the
like
bathroom stalls and walls were more like walls than like just half kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but I was just wondering, is there a reason people decide to go with like half walls and like do have those gaps instead of just going with full walls for like full privacy?
Right. So in my experience, it has always come down to budget. So the current stalls that are the standardized stall design is the ones with the gaps that you typically see. So those provide privacy, but not 100%, as you may know from using washrooms. The full height one comes from a preference one. Usually these are conversations that I wish, like as a designer, I wish they would happen more with clients because there are better solutions out there, but it costs money, and nobody ever wants to invest their money in the washroom when they have the rest of the space they want to. It's the back of the room, if you really think about it. It's not the forefront of your design. So you're not going to, a lot of firms, a lot of designers are not going to spend their big dollars on washrooms. So the difference between them in my experience has been the cost. The cost of full, if you do a search on the full cost of like a full stall that covers from floor to ceiling, first of all, it's more maintenance and more money. And if you're going to cut money, like in my experience, when there's budget cuts, they're going to go to the washroom before they go to the budget cuts in the conference room, for example. So even though sometimes they are designed very early on, and it's just a manufacturing preference, there are lots of manufacturers that do full. In this case, we didn't even take that route because we decided to actually design the stalls from with walls and just different materials that were waterproof materials to as the wall covering. And in this case, we wanted to eliminate the possibility of the contractors coming in and saying, we're going to spare on these stalls and we're going to add these stalls. So instead, we didn't even give them that option. We just went straight to walls and provided a different material type. So
Okay, gotcha.
I think it's one of those things that even if you did design them as per your spec, I am currently working on a freelance currently working on a freelance job where it's actually interesting because they want the designer, the interior designer that's doing the washrooms really wants the full stalls. And in her conversation with the client, they've come to the conclusion that they're going to actually just implement them in the women's washroom and they're not going to implement them in the men's. And that came from a decision from them to save money, but also they didn't seem like, in their opinion, it wasn't an issue for one space, but it was an issue for the other space. So they're going to provide it in the women's events, and that's kind of their way of compromising and still providing that. So you have options, but as a designer, I think you really have to fight for like what you want to implement in your design.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Hi, I had
No
a question. Going back to the pissoir, I believe you had referred to them as urinals. So I was just wondering if those were standing utilities then, and if so, were women still picking flowers?
Yeah, so this was like, so the pissoirs were mainly designed for men. There were later on there were forms of vespasiens that were more like interior spaces that also catered women's. But for the longest time, there was a debate on what to do with them, because on one hand, they were providing hygiene in the city and preventing people from urinating on buildings. But on the other hand, it wasn't catering to the entire demographic, which sparked a raise in providing full washrooms. But that is a good point. They were primarily used for men, and actually just during the war, they were used by different soldiers as hiding spots. So just a fun fact. But yeah, they were primarily just for men, and it did spark the conversation about women's role in the public, and more washrooms were provided for women, but the inequity was still there.
Thank you.
No problem. So bidets, I'm just looking at Trevor's question. So he says, do you predict bidets ever becoming common items in public washrooms? I want to say, because of the cost of washrooms and because of the budgets that usually go in on them, unless a bidet is like the norm, I don't see it being, unless it becomes the general norm, I don't see it specifically being implemented in public washrooms. Because they'll typically, at least at least currently in my practice in Ontario, washrooms are designed by the lowest bidders. So whatever is being proposed by the city will typically go by the lowest bidder. They will always win the bid to build. And so I can't see a scenario where bidets are being proposed where, unless it's the norm, I feel like it would really, it's more unlikely to happen than likely, at least in Ontario. And I think that goes generally for like anything that relates back to public dollars. You're not going to get you're not going to get the prototype, you're going to get the standard in my professional experience. And so I guess I don't know if that 100% answers your question, but I can't foresee it unless it's the standard. Emily says, a little off topic, but what was your favorite thing about researching public restrooms? I guess there was like a lot of like fun facts that came up during my research that I wasn't privy to before, that were kind of fun. Just for me, the most exciting part was thinking about a public toilet as like this street furniture, right? And then it becoming such a big part of our interior spaces, to where like all these contentious issues are happening and the public toilet is always on the forefront. So for me, it's interesting to see like this design object that you would not really relate back to like any type of, in my opinion, as like just looking at the pissoir, like you think of this as a sculpturesque object as part of street furniture, but yet it has so much social meaning embedded in it that like it's hard to separate the two. But yet when one was designed, the other was not really thought of. It was kind of like a product of what was designed. So for me, that is really interesting. And currently in my work is just looking at the intersection of interior and exterior spaces. I think that first drew me to my research is like, how is a washroom so private yet so public? But now I'm experiencing these little pockets of spaces that are actually more so maybe lit in the literal form, public and private. But it's just interesting to see what those spaces could be. There's just a lot of potential, untapped potential, in my opinion. Thank you for asking that.
Well, I have a few questions and maybe it'll spark others, but you mentioned the gallery that serves alcohol impacted the design of the public washroom. What is the relationship between washroom and alcohol in general? Is it related to code? If you serve alcohol, you have to have a certain stipulation, or is it more of a design consideration?
Okay. So in terms of code implications, there weren't any, but what made it challenging was if you go back to the site plan, which is not not the best. Okay, so if we just look at the floor plan, so the main entrance of the gallery space is here, and this is about this entire space that's shaded is public seating area. So the way the seating area had to be divided was there had to be some kind of physical barrier by code that would separate the parts that were being served alcohol and the parts that weren't. These two windows serve alcohol. This washroom was provided so that it could particularly be closed off to serve while this area was being served, while alcohol was being served. This washroom is that, so in case there are alcohol areas being closed off, this would still be accessible to the public. So there were physical aspects that needed to be in place to separate the actual space on the terrace that dictated where the washrooms went. And this was obviously done so that the washrooms could be run regardless if alcohol was being served or not. And in the event that alcohol is not served, all these washrooms are accessible. But there is one thing to note, is that even though these are these are barrier-free washrooms, they're not universal, so they don't cater to all demographics. So these two were important to have, as they were universal in that regards, so that even if in case that this was still accessible, but this was closed off. This is why this washroom here was required. And the barriers are very, they're not, the barriers that I'm talking about that divide the spaces between alcoholic and non-alcoholic are not fixed. So they're furniture, but you need to provide those on your plans. You need to have those in place as part of your checks and everything. So they are part of your, they're not like fixed fixtures, but they have to be in your design plan. So they could be the Velcro red, I forget what you call it, but it could be as simple as like any kind of like chain barrier, but you have the difference have to be denoted.
Interesting. Thank you.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I know that
no
locally there are some code considerations regarding washrooms if you are an establishment that serves alcohol versus not serving alcohol. So I was curious if that was one of the considerations or not.
Okay, I believe in that case it would have to do, I don't know if it has to do, the other thing I could think of would be like occupancy, but in this case, the occupancy was like the washrooms were designed to the occupancy of the gallery, regardless of what was proposed, what because this design started as replacement of washrooms. We weren't too concerned about following following what occupancy required, because we were going to provide more regardless. So this is a little bit more than what occupancy requires, but because they're serving as public washrooms, we designed more. And there is, so this gallery space is part of a bigger master plan on the riverfront. And currently there are washrooms that are designed on one part of the riverfront that's embedded in a private facility. And the biggest is similar to this in that they function year round, but the restaurant doesn't operate year round. But the issue with that was that the washrooms were not identified as being public. So I think this was a topic that was discussed earlier on in the plan of this proposal. The washrooms still look like they're part of the hidden, like part of a bigger establishment, may not always be inviting, but there was a point that was made to the city that they were going to implement signage that would really help in making the washrooms broadcast that they are in fact made for the public and not just for private functions.
Interesting. So speaking of the public-private, I'm really fascinated by, I think you called it the hybridized network that they're doing in London.
Yes.
Where they're putting public government, funded and maintained restrooms in public or in private establishments. Has that impacted where restrooms are usually designed in a space? So a lot of the times they'll be in the back of a restaurant, for instance, but are they now,
Okay.
you might not want people.
I think, yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. And like, I've thought about it too, but but when you think about it, this is a plan that's being implemented on existing infrastructure. So I don't know that would be something interesting to look at, to see like what the dynamics are of that space. Like, imagine walking into a washroom where it's at the end of the cafe rather than the front, or what if it was at the front and this entire vestibule front area turns into its own kind of identity space where it's just completely unrelated. So it would be nice to see what those spaces are actually like. I haven't had a chance to take a deep dive at them, but it really brings up a lot of these interesting questions: is what do these spaces look like, and how do they actually function? And in terms of access, because they're also like private, but they're still public, what's the dynamic there? What's acceptable, what's not? So there's a lot. It is a big topic, I think, that is a whole world that you can just explore on its own. But yeah, it would be interesting to know what those spaces look like. I've also thought about yeah, like when I mentioned like interior urbanized issue, exterior urban issues becoming urbanized urban issues, this is exactly the instances that I would have liked to point out more. I did submit it for the fellowship, but unfortunately I wasn't the winner. So I never got a chance to take a deep dive at that, but it's something that I think in the future that I'm willing to explore, revisiting London, Paris, and New York, and particularly London in those instances. So yeah, thank you for asking that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for presenting your research. We
No
are
problem.
over time, so I don't want to take up any more time. Did anyone have a final question or comment? Okay. All right. Well, thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording here.